morning about everything. And I want to just do what I did a bit last week, actually. So in terms of today, we're going to look into a bit more detail into childhood obesity and the intervention planning to cover the 2 lectures. But I hope there'll be time for you to ask questions for anything that you're not clear about so far. So what I want to do is just quickly summarise, because there's been quite a lot of on-demand material and guided learning put up this week. So just to go over that, and I'm sure that not everyone has listened to everything so far. So if you haven't, don't worry. So this week, in addition to the 2 lectures that we had up from last week, we've got a lecture on nutrition policy by Professor Louis Levy. I've done a lecture on intervention planning and evaluation. And then Dr. Barbara Engel has put up a lecture on the Be Your Best intervention. So the nutrition policy lecture is in 2 parts and has been recorded by Professor Louis Levy, who will be here in a couple of weeks, actually, to do a live tutorial. So in that session, you'll be able to ask him any questions you've got specifically on his content. I don't know if any of you have listened already, and if you have listened, you may have noticed there are some slight sound issues with the recording, and that's because it's been recorded straight into PowerPoint, and then I've uploaded it into Panopto. So there is, unfortunately, nothing we can do about it. There's just a couple of seconds between slides, just in a couple of places where it's missing. So if you haven't listened yet, or if you have and anything wasn't clear, I would just say write down any questions that you've got, and then we can put it to Professor Levy in week 4. But along with the policy lecture, and this is what I'm going to go over now, I've put up the guided learning for policy to include the government obesity plan. So that's chapters 1 to 3 and the latest document that was released in 2020 that's for adults and children. So those links are all on Surrey Learn for you to look through and read. And then my lecture on intervention planning is in 3 short parts. And again, there's guided learning to go with that. And finally, there's a short lecture to introduce Be Your Best. And there is also a document that's been uploaded for the assignment that specifically relates to the outcomes you need for the coursework assignment relating to Be Your Best. So hopefully that is all clear. And as I say, if you haven't yet managed to get through everything yet, don't worry. Does anyone have any questions on the content so far? It may come as we go through the lecture, so don't be afraid to ask questions now, or if the questions come later, put them on the discussion board. So what I want to do is go into a bit more detail on the childhood obesity plan, which has evolved since we've been doing this module. There's been more sort of chapters released and policies and strategies that relate to childhood obesity in England. So I just want to help navigate your way through that and bring in something that we talked about last week in terms of what's upstream, what's downstream. So an upstream intervention or a policy is something that affects the whole of society. So it's a nationwide, national policy, so something around taxation or marketing, for example, so restrictions that affect people upstream in the sense that they're not directly related to their day-to-day activity. So if a product is reformulated to have less sugar, what the individual's doing on a daily basis in terms of buying that, eating that, their behaviour doesn't need to change, but the formulation means that that intervention may have an effect on their overall intake of sugar, for example. So an upstream policy is something that happens outside of individual control, whereas downstream is much more focused on individual behaviours, so giving dietary advice, family-based interventions, something that requires individuals to make a change. And that might also include interventions around education and informing people of a healthy diet. So food labelling still requires individual action to understand the advice, the information, and then make a change. So when we're thinking about policy and how to change nutrition in the UK, there's a balance to be struck between upstream and downstream, and we can start thinking about that in terms of the government policy. Now, this is another slide from my lecture, which is another way of seeing that. So we've got the different levels, I don't know if this is going to show on here, different levels of the population and the different levels of action. So you can see another way of, instead of upstream, downstream, we've now got these different levels affecting the whole population, like legislation, whereas down at the individual level, the actions would be more individual and family-based. And this diagram is in both my lectures and also Professor Levy's lecture, and is another sort of way of showing this. And it takes a while to understand this diagram. There's a lot of information on there, but essentially we've got the different sections up here, so environmental changes, behaviour changes, and changes to physiology. And this end of the spectrum is what we would consider to be national policy, so we're looking at the wider determinants, those things around the taxation system, the wider economy. Whereas in the middle, or the midstream, as we mentioned last week, at a local government level, we may have specific policies relating to town planning, for example, and down here, this is where we're more in individual dietary change. So for those of you who are on the dietetic course, this would be the sort of way you might have an effect on a one-to-one basis. And public health tends to be pulled back more towards the left, where the policy is affecting not just individuals, but this sort of national level policy, which may be more effective because there's less focus on individual behaviour. And any of you will know, and we talked about this last week, what influences behaviour. It's not so easy to have an effect on change if you're handing over that to individuals. So if there are more upstream national policies, then the thought is that that takes away that need for individual action and can be quite effective. The problem with them is that this is the seen here, is the effect is greater, but it's more difficult politically. So there's this move away, or this idea that this nanny state, which many of you will have heard of, is something that people are quite resistant to. And so it's sometimes more challenging to introduce policies where there may be this perception that people are being told what to do or their choices are being interfered with. And you can link back into that ladder of interventions that's in the lecture. So the higher up the ladder, the harder it might be to implement that change. There may be more resistance. Right, so chapter 1 of the policy was first released in 2016, and it had this vague aim, which was to significantly reduce the rate of child obesity within the next 10 years. And I say vague because although it was quantified within a time frame, the word significantly wasn't quantified, so there was no number given to how much of a change they were hoping or expecting to see. The policy included 14 recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all. As I say, the link is there, and this is a relatively short document compared to other government policies and strategies, so it's quite an easy document for you to read through. But two main things came out of it that I'll just mention briefly now. The first thing was the soft drinks industry levy. Have you all heard of this? Sugar tax, people nodding. So that came in from April 2018, and drinks were taxed according to the amount of sugar in them per 100 mils, so the different rates of tax at different levels of sugar. And this has been fairly effective in terms of encouraging change. So lots of industry products were changed even before the legislation came in. Knowing this was happening, lots of companies made changes to their formulation ahead of this change and reduced the sugar content of drinks. And at the time, there were quite a lot of stories in the media about people who were stockpiling old versions of Iron Brew, for example, because they wanted the more sugary option. People who were quite outraged at this change in taste and flavour, etc. So that again, it's quite a difficult change to implement because there's this resistance from the public. But the latest analysis in 2019 shows that overall there was a 44% decrease in sugar content of the drinks. So there has been quite a significant removal of sugar from this category, this fizzy drink sort of category. The idea behind it was that any revenue generated from this so-called sugar tax would be ploughed back into child obesity prevention in another way. So the idea was that it was be used for physical activity equipment in schools, for example. But the main driver was either to raise money, which would help child obesity, or encourage reformulation. And it looks like it has had quite an effect on reformulation. Now, I won't say too much more because there's more detail in Professor Levy's lecture on that. But sugar was also featured in another of the 14 recommendations, which was by 2020 to take 20% of sugar out of food. So again, this is a product reformulation, changing not behaviours, but the content of the food that people are eating. And that's been a bit harder to achieve. So obviously we should have achieved that by now. The deadline for that goal has passed in effect. And the overall change has been just 3%, which is obviously quite a way off that target, but that overall average does mask some of the individual success stories. So within certain categories, there's been big changes in sugar content. So in particular, in breakfast cereals and in yogurts, the change has been much greater. And we haven't perhaps got time to go into this now, but you can bring in knowledge from any of your maybe food science modules or anything else if any of you've worked and done placements in industry. Some categories of food are perhaps easier to change the sugar content than others because sugar is there in the food and makes a difference to the product structure and how it tastes and looks and is. So it's harder to remove sugar from some categories than others, which is relatively easy. So, for example, in soft drinks, it's easier to take that out and replace it with a sweetener than it is in other categories where sugar has properties other than just taste. So again, there's more covered in Professor Levy's lecture on that. So by chapter 2, which was published in 2019, things had moved on a little bit, and there was still this focus on the soft drink sugar, on the sugar tax, but the idea was then to perhaps extend that to include other foods, and this is still an ongoing debate. This hasn't happened, but whether to include milky drinks, which was excluded initially. So that was still under review. There were still reformulation changes in there, this time over not just sugar, but total calorie reduction, with another target by 2024 to reduce calories overall in food categories by 20%. And again, you can read the detail of that. This was a big one that's ongoing, advertising cut-off, and I won't say too much more because Helen has a lecture that she'll do in a few weeks' time on advertising and marketing. But the proposal was for a 9 o'clock cut-off for advertising foods that were high in fat, sugar and salt. Now, you may have your own opinions on that and what you think of that, but actually even coming up with a list of foods that falls into those categories is quite challenging. So while on the face of it that may seem like a sensible or useful approach, getting the detail of that for industry to know, again, which foods would be suitable or not for advertising is challenging. And there's been some backlash and some pushback against industry on what counts and what wouldn't. There were also plans to ban price promotions, so buy one, get one free offers on high fat, sugar, salt foods, and also the multi-buy offers, but also bans on the location of food, so removing these products from checkouts, end of aisle, that sort of thing, so changing the supermarket layout, reducing that sort of pressure from children seeing things at the tills and putting pressure on parents to buy, so trying to change the environment in which we shop. And environment was linked in with working with local communities and working with schools. So I hope this will work. What I've got is a poll everywhere to do. The details to log in my Poll Everywhere account is at the top. You should be able to click this and say which of these approaches would you consider to be an upstream or sort of national approach. So have a think about which of these points on the slide would be an upstream national policy. And I hope that's going to work, that you can see that image and click it. Oh good, something is working. Fab. Good. Any other thoughts? Have you all found it okay? Good. Okay, so I think a few people may be changing their minds as well. So these upstream ideas is what we're looking at, that I mentioned, is out of the individual's control. Okay, well probably most people have responded. So that's interesting. We have a lot of people thinking the school-based initiatives are upstream national approaches. And, so people have selected a lot. I am slightly surprised that not more people have selected the industry sugar tax. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts, or if anyone, the point of me doing this is to help you understand what's upstream, what's downstream, what's a national policy. So if it's not clear, that's what I wanted to do this exercise for, to help you sort of work through this idea. So the sugar tax is an example of an upstream national policy. So anyone who put that, that's great, because that, as I say, it's not within the individual's control. The reformulation of the product has happened at industry level. It's then available nationwide in that product. So a reformulation of a soft drink or whatever has happened, and then what that individual can drink is on the shelf, independent of what they choose to drink, in terms of their behaviour. That's changed at a higher level. And lots more people have put reformulation, which is also correct. So that is also an example of a policy that's affecting intake upstream in terms of beyond control. Some of these others are perhaps more tricky to think about, because although the school-based initiatives would be hopefully nationwide, some of them are still reliant on individual behaviour. So if there are investments in cycling and walking to school, that still relies on individual behaviour change and taking up that initiative. So it's probably, we would say, these are more midstream. So there's not as black and white often as it might first seem, but there is still an element of individual action required. Does that make sense? Good. And you're right, so advertising, promotion, these are all good examples of things that will be helpful in terms of nudging populations to lower calorie sugar intake without them having to do anything themselves. So reformulating products and removing advertising is something that will affect exposure for everybody. Yeah, there's a question.
Have they thought of promoting fruit then? So they're going to take away sugar, etc. Need to then
Promoting fruit.
fruit, like in a different way, saying, fruit salads, it's not like people have 5 days.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So the question for anyone who didn't hear is that so I think you're talking about advertising. If we're removing adverts for certain foods, should we replace those with something different? And Helen, you'll talk about that next week. I don't know if you want to say anything now, but there was a big campaign a few years ago, and it's rerun recently, I think, and it was called Eat them to beat them. Does anyone remember? A few people not Eat them to defeat them. Has anyone seen those adverts? A few people nodding and smiling. So they were exactly that. They were aimed to be very encouraging and popular, but it was in a sort of gamified way, wasn't it? So it was for children to see a challenge of eating fruit and vegetables. And I know this is something you talk about. That
the other thing is the end of aisle promotions. So
yeah.
They've taken away checkout. Shelves for
yeah.
confectionery, and a lot of shops and supermarkets have replaced those with
fruit and vegetables,
or even a box of free fruit for children to pick up.
That's right, when you go into the supermarket, yeah. So yes, you're right, there is trying to strike that balance between promotion and removing existing adverts. The difficulty is obviously advertising is big business, and so the budgets that you need often are different. But yeah, you do see now there's been some adverts within the fruit and vegetable industry, within the dairy industry. So some organisations are getting together to try and promote other foods that are not sort of from an industry perspective. Yeah.
Then so if they don't have the budget there, then they swing it, put it into into TV show. So like at a younger age, they're learning about numbers ABC, blah blah blah. But then again, a bit older, they like incorporate healthy eating, kind of cartoon type thing. That way.
Within a television show.
Yeah, kids are.
Yeah, so that's more around product placement and positive messages in all sorts of media outlets. So yeah, I don't know of any specific examples on that, but yeah, that's the sort of thing that would be this kind of policy and intervention that would be influencing people at all ages across different media outlets. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts on advertising? Or any other questions on this? I hope that was a bit useful to just help you see the difference between actions that still require individual knowledge and change and behaviour change, and actions where the decisions are somewhat removed and sort of help population health through reformulation, through taxation. So thank you, that was good, and it worked. So just to bring in this, I did say last week we're going to use these tutorials to bring in news items, because hopefully you're starting to see this now if you're thinking about public health and probably picking things up and seeing that it's everywhere. So a few weeks ago there were rumours that this ban on advertising before 9 o'clock was going to be reversed, and that there would not be these restrictions. So actually, just yesterday, and this did hit a few news headlines, the Obesity Health Alliance issued a press release that was signed up to by numerous health organisations like the British Heart Foundation and Cancer Research and many more. I can't remember now, but a whole host of people sort of supporting this idea that there should not be this back down on advertising. This 9 p.m. watershed advertising ban has been talked about since 2019 and has been out to consultation. So it looked like it was going through, but there's been this sort of rumour that it may not happen. So I also thought this was interesting because we talked about this organisation last week, Bite Back 2030, and they have also backed this campaign to sort of keep the pressure on, to keep that ban on advertising part of the agenda, and have a way of writing, people to write to their MP to sort of put pressure on and keep that momentum. And just for anyone who did look through that framing toolkit that we mentioned last week, you can see that a lot of the language in this letter to the MP and the language in this campaign is around that positive framing of child obesity and talking about the chance to improve health and well-being in general, rather than just focusing on child weight. So I thought that was an interesting topical new update that just happened yesterday. So moving on, Chapter 3 came out in, late in 2019, but it was actually slightly different. As you see, it doesn't look like Chapter 1 and 2. It was somewhat buried, if you like, I suppose, within another green paper. So it wasn't released as a standalone document in the way the other two were. It's within this larger document on advancing health prevention. But within this, there were lots of reinforcements of the previous policies, but there were new ideas of banning the sale of energy drinks to children under the age of 16. There was a little bit more focus on infants, and part of the reason this was seen in a positive way is that the idea we mentioned last week, that exposure early on is really important. So getting good nutrition habits right from even before birth, breastfeeding, infant school years. So there was more focus on improving the content and marketing of baby food. These childhood obesity trailblazer authorities were planned in 5 areas of the country, and you can read the details of that, but essentially that was working with local government to try and change the local environment, fast food takeaways, access to woodland, places to exercise, things like that. So trying to improve the local environment. More on labelling, either consulting again on how we use the front of pack labelling, and again Helen will cover this in another lecture, so I won't say too much more now, but some ideas around putting the calorie content onto menus in restaurants, takeaways, and you may have thoughts on how useful that would be. But and then in the later plan, there was also the idea of putting calories onto alcohol labels as another way of informing the public and helping them take control. The sugar tax is still under review, and reformulation in terms of salt was mentioned in this. But there was also this focus on individuals, so supporting individuals to maintain a healthy weight, and how we use the data from the National Child Measurement Programme for parents and health professionals. So just to go back to the idea of upstream and downstream, these two now have a bit more focus on individual change, weight management, rather than prevention and having that sort of upstream approach. This is much more about individual action, people taking responsibility for their own well-being, healthy diet and weight. And even labelling requires that knowledge and that interpretation on an individual level. People having the time in a supermarket to look at the traffic light label and understand what that means, and having that knowledge to process that and do something with that information is much more of a downstream individual approach than some of the others that have gone before. So I put this in the first lecture, but I think this is really interesting, and you might not be able to see the detail, but basically we have obesity prevalence in adults, men and women, and the dotted line is obesity prevalence in children, and this is over the last 30 years from 1990. And what this paper has done, and I've put the link on SurreyLearn, is map the 14 government policies that have happened across all different governments from 1992 to the present day. And so there have been these 14 policies, and you can see that that obesity trend has either been slightly increasing or has been static. So this paper is it's a very interesting paper that's reviewed these and trying to think about why these 14 policies have not had an effect on reducing obesity prevalence, and the reasons that might be that that line is static despite all of these documents being produced. So I thought perhaps we could just see if anyone has any responses they want to put in. So your experiences from maybe placement or throughout this course, some thoughts that you might have on what do you see as the biggest drivers or reasons why we have still high rates of obesity despite this collective policy development, messages that have gone out over the last 30 years. What are the top reasons you might think? And this poll, I think, people write something, then you can upvote and downvote responses. Because I thought this would be a nice way to involve your knowledge and your experiences rather than me stand here and say what I think. But maybe no one. Okay, good. Snacking. Lack of activity and easy availability of food. Great. So that point there about lack of activity and availability, that's around the environment in which we live in. So that's sort of a obesogenic environment idea where the norm is now the easy option, the default option is low energy output and lots of availability of food. Good. So a few individual actions on there around self-motivation, lack of motivation, physical activity, food habits, yeah. So, yeah, good. Other macros have a part in increased weight. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but maybe referring to the focus being on sugar and not just another macronutrients like fat, and is that maybe what people meant there? Because that's a valid point that people have criticised, that there has been a lot of focus on sugar reduction and sugar intake, but that might not be the sole driver, and that we've too much focus on one thing can actually not be effective. Good. So people, too much emphasis on individual responsibility. Great. Good. And work life, I don't know again what someone meant by that, but it sounds like that same idea of environmental exposure and how people spend their time and what they have available to them that restricts or enables them to have the sort of particular diets or activity levels. Good. Food inequality is not being properly addressed, and we'll come back to that in a few weeks. We have some more content on that sort of thing, and we've covered inequalities in health and social inequalities, so that's a really important point. Good. Well, we probably should move on, but I think that's very helpful and interesting. And someone's mentioned COVID-19, and in the tutorial in a few weeks, Professor Levy will probably cover that. He does in his lecture, because that 2020 obesity strategy was driven by the fact that there were associations between BMI and COVID outcomes. So there's been a push, again, because of COVID, to help to reduce obesity in the UK. So some really nice points coming through. Thank you very much. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I will move on, but that's nice to see. Sorry, we've covered that. So I just to pick up again on this document, and if you haven't read it, please have a look. There's a lot in there that you might not want to go back and read about every policy from 1990, but some of the more recent policies are covered, and it's quite useful. And what they have said is that a lot of the policies that have gone over the 14 years, over the 14 policies over 30 years, don't always look back and refer to what's happened before. So what was successful, what worked, what didn't. So there's not so much learning between policies. Each time it's mentioned as if it's a new idea. And that's true regardless of whoever was in government at the time. And like someone or a few people have said in that previous exercise, that there's been too much focus on individual behaviour, too much focus on that side of the downstream rather than upstream, and that's possibly because that slide I showed you at the beginning, it's quite hard politically to restrict choice and be that far away and far upstream. But in the last couple of documents on obesity, the Chapter 2 and the Tackling Obesity in 2020, there were more restrictive upstream policies. So it looks like that's potentially changing. And although there is still a focus on individual weight management programs, digital apps and things to help individuals, there's now a little bit more focus on these upstream national policies like banning offers on food, price promotion, location promotion, advertising bans. So there is a sort of move perhaps more towards these bolder political actions of banning and changing what's available. But the other thing is that it's quite difficult to track this. So you see that a policy has proposed a consultation on banning advertising before 9 o'clock. And then that doesn't happen, and it's reiterated in the next policy, and it's reiterated in the next chapter, but it doesn't always translate into legislation. So there's a lot of policies where there's something mentioned, but doesn't always actually follow through into changing legislation. And that's as we've seen this week with those news reports, where it looks like that may or may not happen. So it's quite hard, and that's what we always say in public health. It's quite difficult because you read these government policies and then it's quite difficult then to see, well, what happened after that? There's a consultation where they ask industry and they ask health experts their views, and then it's quite difficult to track through and find, did that go anywhere? Did they actually ban advertising? Did they ban energy drinks? And where are we at with that? And it can take a very long time for change to happen. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to put a few slides in to refresh and give you an opportunity really to ask any questions about the intervention planning, which is very linked because there's lots of crossover between policy and intervention. So what I did in this lecture was show this cycle. So if we think about planning and intervention, first of all, we need the data to know whether we need to. And that's also true at a national level. And then we need to evaluate. And again, that's true with these national policies. We need to know if they happened and if they were effective. But it's also true if we're planning something much more local and small scale. So that's what this framework is about. First of all, we collect the data. Secondly, we evaluate it. So we have this idea of a problem analysis, and now this links in with the tutorial that we had this week in the Zoom tutorial on health profiles, because this health profile resource is the way we gather the data for what's happening in the local area. So where are the problems, where in particular areas are there issues, and what are the issues? So we need to understand the population in which we're operating and where the intervention might need to run. And we went through in the tutorial looking within a local area, so not just the headline figure from Surrey or from Bristol or from wherever, but looking to see within that particular city where are there pockets where there needs to be more effort to improve things. But then we have the underlying causes and the causes of the causes, and this links back with all the things we've talked about in the last few weeks. So trying to understand those wider determinants that exist in an area: income, deprivation, how many people are living in low-income families, the built and local environment, so that's in terms of takeaways, the exercise facilities that exist, whether people feel safe to walk to and from work, etc. So all of that is something we need to understand when we're planning an intervention, and the type of people who live in that area and what would benefit them. So talking with the local people, understanding how an intervention should run, rather than just rolling out a sort of template that it would not necessarily work very well everywhere. And then just to check your an understanding of evaluation, we have two main types: process and outcome or impact. So the process evaluation, as you see, runs alongside the actual evaluation. So if you're running a 12-week program, over that 12 weeks you will collect the data on what's happening and how it's running. Then when it's finished, you will have the data on the outcome or the impact that that's had on what you were hoping to change. So they are very different, but it's important that you understand the difference between them. So the process evaluation is basically asking if it all went to plan. Has it run as you hoped it would run? And if not, why not? Whereas the outcome evaluation is, did it work? So if you're running an intervention to reduce obesity, your outcome might be change in weight, BMI, whereas the process evaluation is nothing to do with your outcome. But what I also put in the slides, and I thought we should just pick up on, is that that's quite a difficult concept. Did the intervention work? Because as many of you will know, if you've worked in weight management, in dietetics, behaviour change and individuals losing weight or changing their diet is very challenging and difficult. So it may be, if you don't have the right measure for your intervention, it may look like your intervention's failed. If you don't see a change in BMI, does that mean it hasn't worked? And what I hope came across is that it's not necessarily did it work, but did it maybe positively contribute? So although a 12-week program may not see a change in weight, if you've improved knowledge, cooking skills, confidence in trying new foods, that in itself is positive and may go on in many years to come to help individuals, but you may not see it within that time frame of your intervention. So I think this is an important point for us, is to think not just in black and white terms of did we hit the target of changing weight, but also what are the other goals that we might have had to improve general knowledge, confidence, etc. So secondary outcomes of an intervention can be really important, and you may not see that change yourself within your intervention, but it may be positive overall. So just as the final exercise to check your understanding on this part of the lecture, which of these would not be process evaluation? So you can select A, B, C or D. So how many people attended the session, the number who completed all of your sessions, why people dropped out, or whether the primary goal was achieved. So which of those is not process evaluation? I'll just give you a minute to do that. Okay, I'll lock that now. Good. Okay, so most people selected primary goal being achieved as not process intervention, and that was the correct answer. So for anybody who got the other answers, go back to the lecture on evaluation, just make sure you understand the difference between the two. And process evaluation is really important, and it is basically checking how well the intervention ran. So that is who attended, why did you have dropouts, how many people were in each session, how many people stayed for the whole 12 weeks, how many people just did 1 or 2, that kind of thing. It's also about how well each session ran. So if you have 6 or 7 elements to a program, did each one run as you'd hoped, and which ones might have been more difficult than others. So on Surrey Learn, there's an example of this. So you can see a school-based intervention, and how from that you basically learn that the nurses didn't have time to run this part of the evaluation, or it was too difficult to do this within schools, they didn't have the facilities. And it's really important that that evaluation happens, because it helps you understand what to do differently next time. So that's process evaluation. Outcome or impact is, did you reach your goal of increasing to 5 a day, reducing fat, reducing weight, whatever it is that you set as your goal, that's outcome, not process. Does that make sense? Anyone not clear? And it's fine if you're not clear, because there's subtleties in that, but it's basically the process is the process of the intervention. Did it work? How did it run? The impact is what change did you see? So hopefully that's clear. And anyone who got the other answers, as I say, don't worry, just go back through and make sure you've got that clear. So we're nearly at the end of time. Next week, you may be pleased to hear there's no on-demand material. So we've purposefully done this. We've front-loaded the module so that you have as much as you need to start as early as you want to for your coursework. So there is a lot, there's been a lot, and that's why I've sort of gone through and highlighted what's there and why. But next week there's no pre-recorded on-demand material for you to look at. So there's a chance, if any of you haven't yet gone through everything and looked at all the guided learning material that's up there, next week, it gets lighter from now on, because, as I say, we do it so that you can have that information for your coursework. But we do have 2 very important sessions next week. So we have live lectures from 2 external speakers. So please do make every effort to come if you can, because these are fantastic people coming in to share their experience of doing this all for real. So it brings the module alive, these external speakers. They come, we've got Jen Smith from Public Health in Surrey, and Bal, who's based in Camden and Islington. And it just brings alive all of the stuff that I've been saying and shows you real world examples. So they're really helpful. Helen, I don't know if you want to add anything, but just to encourage you to come.
They're really worth listening to, and they're doing this kind of thing every day. So it's not just theories. They use these things that Sarah's been talking about in their everyday lives and work.
Yeah, so that's what's happening next week. So final slide that I'll just leave up for anyone who wants to pop questions up about the content. And if you haven't got a question now, please feel free to use either of our discussion boards to post anything. There's been a lot of content, we know that, and we've done it, as we said at week 1, to sort of help